Alright, so the next thing we're doing with this branch is we are UV mapping this. So this is what we want to see. I've got the UV editor open at the moment, and you can find that under UV and UV editor up here at the top. Now if you can't see the menus that I'm seeing up here at the top of the Maya UI, just make sure that this drop down is set to modeling, because if it's set to something else, say like rigging, your menus will be different. So just make sure that drop down is set to modeling so that you do have that UV option. And when you select your object here, so I've already UV mapped this. We want our 2D UV map. So this is a flat picture of our 3D object. We want that 2D UV map to be pretty damn similar to what these faces look like in 3D. So we want the size and shape of our 3D faces to be really close to the size and shape of these 2D faces of the same object. This map is basically what we get to take into Photoshop and use to color and texture our objects. So now, when you're UV mapping for the first time, or when you're modeling for the first time, this is not automatic. This is a process we actually have to go through and do for ourselves. So I'm just going to undo quite a bit, and so you can sort of see, as this steps backwards, what it is I've done. And I'll walk you through this whole process. So you see that at different points I've had different pieces of this. And if I just open the original scene. So when we finish modeling, this is what it looks like. Maya still thinks, and if I just create I'll create a cylinder. So this is what the UV map of a cylinder looks like out of the box. If I select my branch, it looks pretty much the same. There's not a lot of difference. Maya hasn't realized yet, in terms of UV space, that this is changed. It still thinks it's a cylinder. So UV mapping is basically educating Maya to say, no, actually, Maya, this is now a tree. Okay, so we're going to start that education process now. One thing I figure as we're working on this is we probably don't need these faces at the bottom, because we are going to be duplicating this around, and we'll be embedding that bottom shape into the tree itself. So I really don't think we need those at all. It's just going to be one more way to reduce our poly count slightly. Okay, so probably the most straightforward way to UV map this would be planar mapping, just two planar maps, one on either side, and then stitching it together. So I'll show you what I mean by that. So planar mapping means I basically take a picture of one side, and then I take a picture of the other side, and then I stitch them together. It's going to be easiest for me if I divide this along the line up here at the top. So for example, I'll grab these three faces on top of this branch, and then I'll grab their corresponding three faces all the way down to the bottom of the branch. And so what I end up with, what I end up with is half of this object selected on one side. Now, with just those faces selected, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do something called a planar projection. I'm going to take that picture of just those faces so that Maya knows what shape those faces are. So to do that, I'm going to go to UV, and the option I want is under Create, called Planar. I want to go into the options right away, so I don't want to use the default settings. I'll just reset that so you can see what they look like. What I want to make sure I do first is I want to do Keep Image with Height Ratio on. So I'll turn that on, And second, I need to figure out what axis to take this photo on. So you basically want the image to sit across whatever faces you are mapping. And it looks like for that image to sit across, it needs to effectively be perpendicular to it. It looks like it has to be on that z-axis. Remember, so if this arrow red pointing out to the right is x, you could tell that by that compass down there, then the other arrow pointing out from it is blue, that must be z. So we want to change our project from to the z-axis, and we'll press apply, and you'll see a couple things. One, this plane shows up in my Maya viewport, and two, in the UV viewport here, we now have a shape. Our UV shape looks a hell of a lot closer to what it looks like in 3D. A hell of a lot closer. Now if I just undo that, I just want you to see what it looks like if I don't have keep image width height ratio on. So if I turn that off now, hit apply, you'll see that the 2D shape is this like squished down version of the 3D shape, which means any texturing we do is going to be completely warped because the texture expects the shape to be squished down like this. But when it finds itself on a 3D object that's quite long, it's actually going to stretch to accommodate, and it will look like this really ugly, stretched, horrible thing. So we don't want that. So let's just undo and make sure that keep image width height ratio is on. And there is our first planar projection. Now you see how this plane isn't quite sitting perpendicular to those faces. We can actually rotate it slightly. If we click on this little it's like a little crosshatch in the lower left hand corner, that gives us a manipulator handle for this plane, and that allows us to then rotate that so that it's just sitting a little bit more comfortably on those faces. Okay, now in the UV editor, I'm just going to move those faces aside. Now your movement tools work just like they work in 3D space, so W for move, E for rotate, R for scale. And your camera navigation tools are pretty much the same. So like left mouse, so hold down Alt, and middle mouse and left mouse to pan, because you can't rotate in 2D space. Hold down Alt and right mouse to scale. Okay, so we just need to do one more planar projection, this time on the other side, and the easiest way to select the remaining faces, you can either just select them in the UV editor, which will grab them like that, or you can select the shape that you have already done the projection map on. If you hold down Shift and you drag a selection box around the whole thing, what is going to happen, because you already had those faces selected, it's going to end up selecting all of the other faces. So it's going to select all the remaining faces. Either way you want to do it, or of course you can just come in and by hand individually grab them. So I'm just going to grab the remaining faces in the UV editor here, and we're going to pop another projection map on there. The Z arrow is still perpendicular to it, so this is still going to be on the Z axis. And again, keep image width height ratio is on, so I'll hit apply. And that gives me my second group of faces there. The last thing I need to do, because right now you can see there's this line on either side of the branch that shows the border between these different UV shells. If you've ever seen a line in a texture in a game, that's called a seam. It's where basically the texture doesn't quite match up. Every object is going to have a seam, but you generally want to just reduce it, keep it to one, so one seam which you can easily hide. So what I want to do is I want to take these two shells in the UV editor and I want to stitch them together. The way to do that is, I'll just open up that UV editor now, is I want to go into edge mode, so right click and hold on the object and go edge. And every time so when I hover over an edge, you'll see it highlights the edge that it is connected to in 3D space. Now we do have a problem here. These two edges should be facing each other, so they should be, one should be they should both be on the inside of these shapes. But they're both facing out, so it's going to be very hard to stitch them together, which means that one of these shells need to be flipped. So I'm going to right click and hold over the one on the right, go to shell, which is there, and shell grabs the whole piece, and I'll go up to polygons in my UV editor, and I just want to flip it. So there we go. When I go back to edge mode, you'll see that they highlight the pieces are basically they're looking at each other, they're ready to stitch. So I'm just going to select these interior pieces, go up to polygons, and I want move and sew UV edges. So if I click on that, you'll see it snaps that together. And the last thing I want to do, because this is bad, we don't want that jumbled mess, mostly because in the 3D viewport, if you look at the top of this object, it's not a jumbled mess. So as always, you want your 2D UV space to reflect your 3D physical space. So back in the UV editor, I'm going to select all the UVs on my object. I'm going to go up to polygons, and what I want is I actually want the old unfold version. So I'm going to go to unfold options, and by default my 2017 comes in with unfold 3D. I want to use the legacy version for this just because after a few experiments I found out that the legacy version gives me the best unfold. So if I just hit apply, you'll see what that's done is that's just laid out these pieces quite neat and tidy, and you'll see that each face is about the same size and shape of what it looks like in 3D space, which is exactly what we're after. And there's no UV maps laid on top of other UVs. Okay, so that has been unfolded. Now the thing with unfold, 3D or legacy, just switch between them. Try both. Select one, hit apply, and if it doesn't quite work, undo, select the other, hit apply. The thing with UV mapping is that there are, every object is going to have a slightly different technique for UV mapping it. You just sort of have to experiment until you find the right one. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to do before I wrap this up is I'm going to make sure that these UVs are sitting inside this neat little gray square, because that is effectively the gray square that will be spat out of Maya when I take this into Photoshop. So I'll just set that as neat and tidy as I can in there. Now I suspect I might end up moving some of my UVs around, as in when I duplicate it around I might actually have this sitting down here to the side a bit and have a couple more UVs about, like duplicate it around and have different branches assigned to different parts of my texture map. Maybe, I don't know. For now though, what matters is that this object has been UV'd. I'm now very comfortable about duplicating this around, knowing I don't need to UV map each and every branch. I could just UV map it once and it's done. Okay, once again I'm going to delete history on that because you can tell under its inputs that quite a lot has happened. So just delete history so it's nice and clean, and I will save my scene, and we will get into duplicating it around in the next lecture.